Those of you who have lost someone close, did you discover any unknown secrets after their death? Serious. After my husband's grandmother passed away in Jan, they found a photo from the 1940s of a handsome man in uniform amongst her things. The back reads something along the lines of "with my deepest love and devotion, Terry," but it wasn't her husband, who she was married to during the war, and no one had ever heard her mention him before. He must have meant something to her, to hold on to that photo for 70 plus years. Could have been a boyfriend or dear friend who never made it back. Pretty sure something similar happened to my grandmother. My great-great-grandmother met my great-great-grandfather on Ellis Island when immigrating to the US. She was 16 and he was 17, or so everyone believed. When she died just after her alleged 97th birthday, my family discovered from immigration logs she was actually 100 and had lied about her age because it wouldn't have been acceptable in society to A, be single at 19 and B, marry a younger man. My great aunt lied about her birthday when she was 19 on her driver's license to state that she was 16. Nobody ever doubted her or double checked, so she was thought to be 3 years younger than her actual age for the rest of her life. We didn't find out about until she died. It was just like her, though. She was funny as heck. My grandmother was a lovely lady. She had little money and lived simply. We loved each other and it was a special relationship. When she died, I was very surprised to discover that she had quietly scrimped and saved over the years and left enough money for me in her will to pay for my college education. That was her dream, and I had no idea, as she never said even one word about it. That's amazing. What a special gift to leave for someone unknowingly. My great-grandfather died and left a bed set, the only thing he had in his name, to me. Him and his wife bought it when they married in the 1920s. It's very special. My grandfather was a great guy, who was also kind of crotchety. He died on the 30th of December. For as long as I knew him, his birthday was the 31st of December. We all wished he lived one day longer to see his next birthday, or at least die on his birthday like Shakespeare, because that's poetic. When we were cleaning out his stuff we found his birth certificate. Lo and behold, he was born on the 30th of December. He hated parties so much that he always lied about when his birthday was, so that he only had to celebrate one. My mom even thought his birthday was the 31st of December. He lied to his own children, but at least he died on his birthday like Shakespeare. In India, January 2013, both of my grandparents died just hours apart. At the time, my mother and I were told that my grandfather died of a brain hemorrhage and my grandmother died in her sleep. My aunt and uncle flew from England, where they reside, to India when they heard my grandfather was in a coma from the hemorrhage. This year, my mother began talking to a man in India who was one of my grandfather's best friends. This man was with my aunt and uncle during the time of their death. According to this man, my aunt and uncle woke up and found my grandmother dead in her bed and just left her there. They didn't do anything about her dead body for hours. They just left it in her bed, while my grandmother's corpse was still in her bed. My aunt and uncle went to the hospital to see my grandfather. The doctor said my grandfather would come out of the coma soon and would be fine. But my aunt and uncle decided to pull the plug on him anyways. They went back to the house, and one of the housemaids showed my aunt that my grandmother's dead body was foaming at the mouth. My aunt took her scarf, wiped away the foam and kept the scarf there to prevent anyone from seeing the foaming. So basically my aunt and uncle killed my grandparents. A couple years ago, my great uncle passed away. When he died, in addition to a mansion in Chicago, he left $15 million for his children to split up, $3 million each. As it turns out, he used to be only 2 steps below kingpin of a large Chicago mob. He took some money and left for good after getting shot and realizing that he didn't want his children to grow up without a father. Also, his wife had owned 2 whorehouses before selling them and marrying him. After my dad passed, I found out he had run a flamethrower for 3 months digging the Japanese out of the caves in the Philippines. My dad didn't talk about the war much. He never mentioned this part. Found out from mom he had terrible nightmares all his life about it. Flamethrower duty is probably close to the worst from what I've heard. My grandfather used mob loan money to start his business. Found this out when a retired mobster showed up at his funeral reception. I feel naive, but my initial thought was something of a Godfather mob era, one where the mafia wasn't necessarily to be feared, but another source to go to for help and serve the community even if it's less than legal ways. I really hope that was the case, and not. Maybe this is a little heavy, but here goes. My grandma was killed by my uncle. Not my real uncle. Second cousin, I think. When I was around 11 years old, the adults in the family tried to shield a bit of the details, but the story made the news, so I heard enough about it anyways. My great grandma had died about 5 years prior to this. She had been stabbed to death, but no killer had ever been convicted. Anyways, after my grandma was killed, new evidence came to light, and we found out it was my uncle who was responsible. I wasn't particularly close with my grandfather. I was young when he died, but as he was dying, he had to have a breathing tube put in. After he died, the doctors presented my grandmother with his false teeth. Apparently, when he was 21, as a birthday present, his father had taken him to the dentist to have all his teeth pulled and have false ones put in. No one knew, including his wife and all his kids. Apparently this was common practice. My great uncle Ray and great aunt Ann lived in a little house on the outer edge of town. Never had children or pets. Their house was always in some disarray. Roof needed repaired or siding falling off. When Uncle Ray's truck broke down, he didn't get it fixed. He just rode a bicycle around town. He always wore Levi's blue jeans and a white cotton shirt. He would mow lawns for some extra money, and he was a car salesman back in the day. Ray and Ann passed away 3 hours apart, in different facilities. Ann first, then Ray. Since Ray was the last one living, they contacted his next of kin, which was my mom. She got a call from a lawyer and was scared to call him back because she thought they were going to make her pay for the funerals. Lawyer says no, you just need to come in and talk to me. Stacks and stacks of CDs and bonds. Laundry basket filled with cash, covered in clothes, cash rolled up under kitchen sink, some here, some there, multiple bank accounts. Ended up being close to $2 mil. The only bill my mom had to pay in Ray's name after he passed was his electric bill. $37. Whoa, that's amazing. My great grandfather lived with me since I was born. I pretty much knew everything about him, but after he died I learned a few interesting stories. One was how back in the 50s, he used to be a raging alcoholic and went out partying all the time. Then one day he woke up and found my great grandma beaten almost to a pulp. He asked who did it. It turned out he did in a drunken fit. After that he quit drinking cold turkey. The only time he ever drank afterwards was my uncle's wedding in 1986 and his 75th birthday in 2005. This might be one of the saddest things on this thread. Friend committed suicide. After his death, I found out B was beyond abusive to his wife, to the extent of holding her and their kids at gunpoint. I knew he was bipolar and alcoholic, but had no idea how bad this was. It's making me feel conflicted about whether to miss him or not. I feel like I miss him because he was my friend for a decade, but I hate him for being abusive. For what it's worth, I don't think anyone could blame you for missing a good friend. You wouldn't expect his wife and children to excuse his actions because he was a friend to you, nor should you dismiss his friendship in light of his actions as a husband and father. My best friend since kindergarten, Cheryl, was killed by a drunk driver along with her father. Since the 7th grade, I wrote her a poem every month and mailed it to her. They weren't Maya Angelou quality, but it's the thought that counts, right? I pretty much thought she would just throw them around after reading them a few times, but I discovered she had a shoebox under her bed with all 37 poems from 7th grade when I started writing them to 9th grade when she was killed. That's so heartwarming you could fry eggs on my chest. My grandpa was a massive racist for a long time, until very late in his life when he calmed down a bit. After his death we found out that he had been financially supporting underprivileged African American kids secretly for at least a few years. That's a really sweet story, unless the kids he was supporting are his. When cleaning out my grandmother's house after her passing, we found that she had hidden my mother's acceptance letter to Stanford, which contained a full scholarship. My grandmother's house was a few hours from Stanford, so distance wasn't an issue and finances weren't either. This is a miscellaneous memory. Before she died, she used to steal all the neighborhood cats. When she moved in with us, all the neighbors came to her house to reclaim their cats. She would put food out for them and then lock them in at night. Eventually they all just stopped going home. She had about 7. The only 2 I remember are Squeaky, who did in fact squeak, and Yellow Cat, who was very orange. The day my mother died suddenly, I found out that both she and my dad had been married before. On top of this, the cousin that used to come visit us when I was a child was actually my half-sister. She had stopped coming around, but I always liked her and wished she would come back. Sad part is, even my father had lost track of his own daughter. Long story involving the secret they were keeping from me, a marriage and subsequent move and then divorce of my half-sister, and he hadn't able to locate her for years. Happy ending 18 years after my mom's death. My sister contacts me out of the blue, we meet up for a tearful reunion, and shortly afterwards, father and daughter are reunited at last. We all love each other dearly and love to get together. We each live in different states. I am so confused by this. My grandmother died rather quickly. She got sick with pneumonia between Thanksgiving and Christmas, and she passed away just before Valentine's Day. It was very tough on my grandfather, especially as they'd been married for over 40 years and both of them had led exciting lives together. It was several years before my grandfather packed her clothes and belongings away, and naturally he asked for his kids, my mom and uncles, to help since it was tough. When they checked her code for anything that may need to be packed separately, they found dozens of horse racing betting slips. In fact, it was hundreds of dollars worth of bets, all them relatively recent to her death. Her purse also contained as many, if not more, betting slips. What was even more interesting was that she was really good at it. As in, she was going to the track and coming back hundreds of dollars richer. My grandfather said he knew she liked to go to the horse races, and knew she occasionally gambled, but had no idea that she was as good at it as she was. We all laughed about it because frankly, it was just one facet of a very amazing and accomplished woman. I like your store the best. All the other ones are so morbid and weird. Whereas your situation is kind of like a funny joke surprise from your grandma after the fact. My father, in the late 50s, helped rob a bank in New York. He drove the getaway car. He did the full 5 years he was sentenced to because every time he got asked about the guys he worked with he said nothing. Good man. Seriously, say what you will about the bank robbery aspect, but you don't eat on people. Not to cops, not to friends, not to wise guys, not even to your own mother. My grandfather died when I was a toddler. He had been married 3 times and had 3 sets of 3 children. Approx 25 years after his death, another child comes forward. She was put up for adoption. My mother nor the other 8 of her half siblings knew anything about her before she found them. Also, my grandmother, the aforementioned grandfather's wife, had a secret child herself as a teen. Apparently it was a secret teen pregnancy and she was sent away to have the baby and for it to be put up for adoption. They were in contact though. There are pictures of them together, right up until my Gma died. Apparently my Gma thought the family would never understand. Also, to add to the confusion, my grandfather and grandmother were actually never married. He did marry the other 2 women he had 3 children with. Gma just took his name and lived like a wife divorcee. Was scratching my eye and read my grandfather died when he was a toddler. I was very confused. When my grandpa died he had changed his will to include myself and my siblings, putting the money in a college fund to be split equally. My grandpa never helped my mom go to college because he didn't think it was a woman's place to get higher education. My mom still remained in contact with him even though it upset her, and before he died he said how much he was proud of her for everything she had done. His college fund he left for my siblings and I included an equal portion for my sister. Found out my grandfather was gay 2 years after he died. His wife, my grandmother, was in total denial that he had been cheating on her with other men for all 50 years they were married. She finally admitted that it was AIDS he died of, not a random illness. Dang. Mom and dad divorced when I was 4ish. Brother and I lived with her. Mom died, but I didn't know how till I was 13 and kept pestering my parents. They told me she was depressed over losing my dad, and later a boyfriend, and she hung herself. It wasn't until my 30s that I found out she did it at work. and an older gentleman walked in, saw her twitching from the ceiling, and dropped dead on the spot. Years later, after my father passed in 2008, there were several single weeping unescorted women at his funeral. I always knew he was a bit of a cad. One of my father and stepmom's good friends was actively fricking my dad until he got sick. My grandfather overdosed. He was a veterinarian who had access to whatever it was he was addicted to. I never found out the specifics. I remember one day he came outside where everyone was celebrating a holiday and was bleeding really badly. He told everyone he cut his leg on a broken clay pot. He had broken a needle. He was a great guy, a man of the community, and someone no one would ever suspect of substance abuse. Just goes to show that everyone's lives are more complicated than it seems on the surface. I think people forget that there are plenty of functional addicts out there. This is more deathbed than after death. My great aunt died in a care home at the age of 94 last year, having outlived her husband of many years. Shortly before her death, she told the nurses some of her life story and revealed a diary that she had been keeping for most of her life. Our family was pretty surprised to find that she had been married previously to not one but two soldiers in quick succession while she'd been working as a nurse in World War II. Both of her previous husbands were killed in combat and she kept the secret from the entire family until her deathbed. Basically, my great aunt was a bit of a minx. A family friend. Almost an uncle and next door neighbor. We saw this family every day. Their kids and us were inseparable. He worked as a salesman and traveled quite frequently. He died unexpectedly one day of a heart attack. At his funeral, his other family shows up. He had another wife and kids in another part of the country the whole time. Nobody knew. I grew up thinking my family was well off. I always had brand name clothes and nice holiday presents, and my mom drove me to lots of out of town school events without being concerned about gas. When she died, I learned she had left behind a great deal of credit card debt. We actually weren't doing that great financially, but she wanted so badly for me to fit in, so she gave me everything other kids had, even if she couldn't afford it. I found one of her last journals that said how badly she wanted for me to be accepted. I still wasn't. But I appreciate her effort. I wish I could thank her for trying. How sweet of her. I never really fit in per day, but my mom didn't care. She taught me to just be. If I wanted to live in a van and travel, she would support me. If I wanted to go to law school, she would support me too. I became a stay-home mom, and kind of a hippie, much like her. I work at a TV station. I had a co-worker, a producer and reporter, who absolutely loved Oprah and everything Oprah related. After she passed, I found out she was actually working part-time at Harpo on the weekends the whole time, but told almost nobody here because she didn't want anyone to think she didn't care as much for us. 2 stories. When my nan, great-grandma on my mom's side, passed, I inherited a lot of Japanese items from her. I wondered how she got them. As far as I knew, she stayed in Canada her whole life on the farm and hairdressing after her husband passed. My great-grandfather passed away when my grandma was 16. She apparently met a young Japanese woman that was going to the same hairdressing school as her back in the 1950s. Her family owned land in Japan, including private hospitals in Tokyo, and was rather wealthy. When she returned home, they still kept in touch and paid for my nan to visit. She still had yen from the 50s, and my Japanese friends thought it was so cool as they never saw notes that old. I also have a really beautiful doll that I inherited. I wish I talked to her more about it when I was younger. But it was amazing to learn all this stuff, even after their passing. My dad passed away suddenly in 2013. Afterwards, I learned from my mom that the two of them practically moved in together a week after meeting. Married for almost 25 years, and the happiest couple I knew. I miss him every day. When my grandpa died, I found out that he had 11 kids from a previous marriage. None of his grandkids knew, but I guess everyone else kept it hush hush until the funeral. Glad I have a place to crash in France now. Nobody notices the 2 in S at the end. Nobody, but me. After my grandpa died, we found out he had a massive gambling addiction. My dad said that it had apparently been going on the entire time he was married to my grandma, but even though my grandparents argued a ton when my dad was growing up, it was never brought up at all, and they always managed to just barely have enough to get by. It was only found out about because they found that he kept super detailed records of every cent he earned and spent. My grandmother killed herself on my 11th birthday in my parents' house. I later found out that she was an alcoholic and had borderline personality disorder and put my mom and her brothers through heck growing up. Anytime something didn't go her way, she would attempt to kill herself and end up in the hospital. As she got older and couldn't take care of herself, she moved in with my family. My mother warned her that if she was going to try anything stupid, that she better not make a huge scene. She got drunk and crap all over the bathroom walls and floor on the first night. She only lasted a few days after that. I was told she died in her sleep. The real secret I found on my own was when I was looking for my birth certificate many years later. I stumbled upon a birthday card from her that my mom had kept. My mother later confessed to me that it was found under my grandmother's body. My maternal great uncle committed suicide while he was still in the army. He had been stationed in Germany for some number of years after fighting in World War II and fought his transfer back to the States really hard. No one ever really knew why. The moment he got back to the States, he put a bullet in his head. So many years later, my mom is conducting some genealogy research and finds a photograph in a big stack of stuff that belonged to him. In the photograph, he is standing with a woman affectionately, arm around the shoulder, smiling, and in front of them is a baby in a carriage. My great uncle fathered a child with a German woman, and we have no clue who she was. Since he killed himself, we have no correspondence or information other than this singular photograph. It bums me out. Post the photo and see if anyone recognizes it. Just have to hit enough of a wide audience. This isn't scandalous, but it's very sweet. My great aunt, Gladys, and her husband, John, were both blind. She was born that way, and he became so after an accident. They met each other at a school for the blind. Due to medical advancements, John would have been able to go through a simple surgery to completely restore his eyesight a few years into their marriage, but he chose not to because it wasn't fair that Glady couldn't have hers restored as well. To him, there was no point unless they could have been equals. None of this came out until after she died. He died 20 years previous, and we were cleaning their house out. John had kept the paperwork, but they had never spoken about it to the rest of the family. This is so adorable. 3. My great aunt was my great uncle. I'm cool with it though. Kudos to her for doing that in a time where it was really hard. AWW, I'm glad you're so cool about it. That my mom had a brother. My uncle was the black sheep of the family, ran away after high school, in and out of prison his whole life. You get the idea. My grandfather, he saved pennies. All the pennies. We found over $2,000 in his basement crawl space, in pennies. Fortunately, he also was very meticulous about rolling them, though in his old age, he didn't roll them as often. There was maybe $300 or $400 of unrolled pennies, but the rest were thankfully rolled. I had a client that I became pretty good friends with. His grandfather and myself have the same first name. It's an uncommon name. It led to him telling me that his grandfather was an engineer for a railroad company, lived in West Virginia and was gone a few days a week as part of his job. When his grandfather died and they went to the funeral, a lady and 4 children that no one knew were sitting towards the front of the church. It came out that he had a wife on the other end of the line and raised 2 families. He had 9 children between the 2 wives. I found out my beloved great-grandfather was, friendly with his daughters. It changed the way I looked at my entire family. A secret as big and disturbing as that is life-changing. I send good thoughts your way. Not so much a secret as an omission, and certainly not remotely scandalous, but after my grandmother died we found letters written from her to her mother, from boarding school. Despite being an open and honest person throughout her life, my grandmother had never once mentioned going to boarding school, and her kids thought they had a pretty solid timeline of her life, including a couple of group school photos, reports etc, so they had no idea when this could have been. My grandmother also grew up absolutely dirt poor, never enough money to eat, so how she ended up at boarding school is a complete mystery. Interestingly, her relationship with her mother was very strained, and she was very upset when my aunt sent her children to boarding school. I wonder now if there was a connection between that and her own experiences. My grandfather, my mother's dad, was the sweetest, most kindest man in the world. He died back in 2009 in Mexico from pancreatic cancer, and I never really knew much about his past because he never really said much. Just found out last week that he was a boxer and would fight people in Mexico for money. Apparently he was really good. Also found out that he met my grandmother on a radio singles show where you would write to them and they would say your information on air and you could write to each other or something like that. Not even my grandmother had ever told me that. It's kinda cool. My grandmother was frail and sick throughout her life. When she passed away, my grandfather said that she used to ride motorcycles and be part of a gang, even though she was always sick. Not really a dirty secret, but my grandmother hid money all over her house. My dad bought the house off the trust and ended up finding $30K hidden in cupboards, the fruit cellar, attic, etc. Shortly after my mom passed away, I overheard my older sisters talking about how my oldest brother, the oldest sibling, was not my dad's son. It turns out that my dad had married my mom when she was pregnant by someone else. No one knows who the someone else was. My sisters were talking about it more openly since my dad had passed years earlier and my brother is Mia from the Vietnam War. When I expressed my shock to them, they were actually surprised I didn't know. My grandfather passed a few years ago. My mother and I have been working on our ancestry and we found out that my grandfather ran booze in Far Rockaway Beach with every big name booze runner in New York during Prohibition. We always knew my grandfather had a past drinking problem and couldn't ever touch the stuff again, but he never spoke about how or why he developed the problem. My brother just went through this. His best friend was his business partner. His friend died in his sleep, most likely drug related. My brother was the one to clean up his stuff and help out the family. My brother found out the friend was embezzling company funds for hard drugs that he was going to use company opportunities to sell. On company hardware he left evidence that he was a sadist and was plotting to do a lot of harm with any measurable success the company had. There were videos of him abusing W and texts of how he intended to frick over everyone in his path, including my brother. I brought home some testing hardware that was no longer going to be used and it turned out to have lots of dong pics. My brother helped with the memorial and press, never letting on what he learned. Of course, he never would, but knowing what he learned and seeing him move past this was commendable. Dang, I would feel so hollow and betrayed to think your best friend was just a farce. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.